Have you ever wondered why so many important stories seem to have disappeared over time? And why, in so many of these stories, are women relegated to the shadows or turned into secondary characters? The truth is that, for centuries, valuable knowledge was erased, persecuted, and hidden, creating a narrative that favored only one side. But what if you could find out what really happened? What if there was a pattern behind this, involving power, manipulation, and the censorship of extraordinary female figures? In this video, we explore the best-kept secrets about the women who shaped spirituality and history, but have been deliberately erased. We will open the forgotten pages of forbidden texts, investigate the most uncomfortable silences in religious history, and reveal the impact of these omissions on the world we know today. Prepare for a journey filled with unexpected revelations, hidden knowledge, and questions that challenge everything you've ever believed. And while we delve into these mysteries, be sure to like this content and subscribe to the channel. Together, we will discover truths that have been excluded, persecuted, and finally revealed. Imagine a time when narratives were shaped by those in power, and the role of Mary Magdalene began to be carefully rewritten. Far from the controversial figure associated with prostitution, she appears in the Apocryphal Gospels as a leader, someone who dared to question the mail order. In the Gospel of Mary, we see a glimpse of her defiant position as she confronts Peter, one of the apostles. But why, after all, was this figure of strength transformed into an icon of sinful redemption? Perhaps because such powerful knowledge about his leadership was, like many texts, deliberately censored and hidden. Behind the scenes of early Christianity, Mary emerges as one of the central pieces of a puzzle that few were allowed to complete. Gnostic texts, such as the Gospel of Thomas, reveal an educated woman close to Jesus, sharing profound dialogues that went beyond dogma. Isn't it ironic that the same church, which would later consolidate its power, chose to exclude such important female figures? Maria's exclusion was not accidental. It was a strategic decision to erase the possibility of female leadership. This is the kind of forbidden truth that transforms our view of religious history. In 325 AD, the Council of Nicaea marked a watershed in the construction of Christian narratives. In this scenario, female voices, like that of Mary Magdalene, were stifled in favor of a centralizing male structure. She, who symbolized courage and wisdom in a movement in gestation, was relegated to oblivion or defamation. The question that remains is, who really gained from this distortion? Perhaps leaders who realized that control over occult knowledge could be a powerful weapon to dominate the masses. The analysis of excluded texts, such as the Apocryphal Gospels, leads us through a labyrinth where women played fundamental roles, but which were erased from the official versions. Mary Magdalene was no exception. She was a threat to the established hierarchy model. When we look at this evidence, we realize that the official narrative is not only incomplete, but also purposefully edited. Here, silence says more than any proclamation and raises questions about how many other truths were pursued until they disappeared. Perhaps it is time to unearth the hidden and censored secrets that the official Gospels do not tell. It's not just about restoring the honor of Mary Magdalene, but about understanding how power structures use narrative manipulation to shape history. If Mary's role was so profoundly suppressed, how many other female figures were condemned to oblivion? It's a question that not only resonates, but also sets the stage for another story of female rebellion that remains in the shadows. Have you ever heard of Lilith, the woman who dared to say no to paradise itself? According to the alphabet of Ben Sira, she was created alongside Adam, made from the same dust and not from his rib. When ordered to submit, Lilith refused, preferring exile to conformity. This narrative, of course, was kept in the margins, hidden as a forbidden secret, as it challenged the ideal of female obedience. Rather than a submissive companion, Lilith became an uncomfortable symbol of resistance. In Jewish traditions and Mesopotamian mythologies, She's associated with figures such as Inanna and Ishtar, goddesses who also represented power and independence. What's fascinating is how Lilith was transformed from a mythical character into an evil archetype. His story is not just an old tale. It is a demonstration of how the patriarchy censored women who dared to rebel. After all, who would be interested in allowing this narrative to survive? With all its potential to inspire female autonomy, even biblical scriptures, in passages such as Genesis 1-27, suggest a simultaneous creation of man and woman, which contrasts with the narrative of Eve made from Adam's rib. Lilith was excluded because her presence threatened the balance of a world ordered by men. Instead of being celebrated as the first female voice of resistance, she was demonized as the bringer of chaos. But doesn't this exclusion say more about who wrote the rules than about Lilith herself? Over the centuries, Lilith has been relegated to darkness, but her image has resurfaced as a symbol of feminism and freedom. What the alphabet of Ben Sira did was crystallize an old fear, that free women were dangerous to structures of control. Isn't it curious how stories like hers were persecuted until they became forbidden legends? The fact that Lilith still inspires so much fascination reveals the power that exists in forgotten narratives. So, what can we learn from Lilith? Maybe your story is less about rebellion and more about choice. His refusal to bow to Adam is a reminder that freedom often comes at the price of exclusion. But if Lilith was so demonized, how many other female voices were similarly silenced? And this leads us to think about the texts that praise these women, but that never saw the light of day. Imagine that there are ancient texts that exalt women as spiritual leaders, but that never made it into the pages of the Bible that we know. An intriguing example is the Book of Enoch, where celestial beings share wisdom with humanity, highlighting female figures as bearers of divine knowledge. Another is the Gospel of Philip, which mentions Mary Magdalene as Jesus' companion, a title that went beyond what religious structures could tolerate. It is curious how these texts were not only excluded, but persecuted, as if hiding a truth was more important than preserving it. Proverbs 8 is another fascinating example. The personification of wisdom as a woman, Sophia, reveals a feminine presence in the creation of the world. But why has such a central figure been forgotten? The wisdom of Solomon also speaks of an essential feminine force in cosmic balance, a theme that would certainly be inconvenient for a tradition that wanted to centralize the male role. These puzzle pieces are more than ancient texts. They are evidence of hidden and deliberately erased knowledge. The impact of this exclusion shaped the narrative we know today, removing the prominence of women. The exclusion of apocryphal books was not a simple theological issue. It was a political act. After all, who would decide what was divine or heretical? What is clear is that the exclusion of texts that exalt women helped solidify a patriarchal Christianity, where power was centralized in male hands. And what does this say about the truth we know today? When we analyze these forbidden texts, we realize that they challenge the idea that women were always supporting characters. If Mary Magdalene, Deborah, and other powerful figures were extolled in ancient writings, why was this erased? Perhaps because these narratives revealed a spiritual equality that threatened the control of those in power. What is evident is that there is much more behind the scenes of religious history than we have been told. Are there still lost texts out there, buried under layers of censorship and persecution? Books that could completely change our view of the role of women in spirituality. When we think about what was deliberately excluded, it is impossible not to wonder, how many other stories are still waiting to be discovered? This leads us directly to think about the female figures who, even in the official Bible, defied convention and left their legacy. Imagine a time when female prophets not only existed, but led on equal terms with men. Deborah, a judge and prophetess described in chapters 4 and 5 of the Book of Judges, was a military strategist and spiritual counselor. When military leader Barak hesitated to act without her, Deborah took on a role that defied all patriarchal norms. Huldah, in turn, appears in 2 Kings 22 as the woman who interpreted divine law for King Josiah, proving that spiritual knowledge was not exclusive to men. But why are these extraordinary figures almost forgotten in modern discussions about the Bible? Biblical archaeology suggests that women had much more active roles in spiritual leadership than we are led to believe. In neighboring cultures, such as the Canaanite and Mesopotamian cultures, women served as priestesses and oracles, which is echoed in the presence of Deborah and Huldah. However, over time, male traditions suppressed this heritage, replacing it with a narrative more convenient to patriarchy. It is interesting to note how these women have been relegated to oblivion, while male leaders with less impressive feats are widely exalted. The cultural context of the time reveals a lot about this exclusion. The centralization of religious power in the temple under male leadership contributed to minimizing the importance of female figures such as Deborah and Huldah. Not only were they prophetesses, but they also represented a model of spiritual authority that contrasted with the growing emphasis on male leadership. This raises an uncomfortable question. Who gained from the marginalization of these women? And most importantly, what was lost by its exclusion? When we look at these stories, it is clear that they challenge the idea that women have not played prominent roles in spirituality. Deborah led troops. Huldah advised kings. What else might these figures have done had their contributions not been censored or minimized? They represent a fragment of forbidden knowledge that official history preferred to forget. As we explore these figures, we begin to realize how incomplete the narrative presented to us is. And then the inevitable question arises: how many other Deborahs and Huldahs have been erased from the pages of history? How many spiritual leaders have been condemned to silence simply because they are women? These stories prepare us to delve even deeper into the evidence of ancient communities that recognize the central role of women, as discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the deserts of Qumran, among caves forgotten by time, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, a discovery that shook the foundations of archaeology and theology. These texts, dating back more than 2,000 years, reveal a different view of ancient Jewish communities. Among the surprises, there is evidence that women played relevant spiritual roles, something that contradicts the traditional narrative. Imagine the impact of such forbidden knowledge emerging from the sands of oblivion. But, as expected, this information never made it into the Sunday sermons. The Essene community associated with these manuscripts was known for its rigorous rituals and apocalyptic worldview. Although many scholars argue that it was an exclusively male group, fragments of the text suggest the involvement of women in their religious practices. It is fascinating how this evidence was treated with an almost reverential silence, as if mentioning women in spiritual roles was a taboo subject to be censored. After all, who decides which truths are acceptable and which should be buried? These texts not only mention women, but also suggest that they may have held positions within the spiritual structure of these communities. The idea of women actively participating in sacred rituals is revolutionary when compared to traditions that have relegated them to secondary roles. Could this be another case of persecution of knowledge that challenged the status quo? History seems to show us yes. And it is not surprising that these fragments remain more frequently cited in academic circles than religious pulpits. The Dead Sea Scrolls are also a window into the complexity of Jewish spirituality in the Second Temple period. This was a time of profound transformations, and the exclusion of women from official narratives was a reflection of power struggles. However, these texts are a quiet reminder that behind the curtains of history, there was a much richer and more inclusive dynamic. How many other censored secrets still rest in untranslated fragments? And so, these manuscripts make us question, what if women had maintained the protagonism they apparently had in communities like this? What would the spiritual world we know today be like? Perhaps it's time we turn our eyes to the forgotten details of history and examine what has really been lost over the centuries. A reflection that prepares us to revisit the narrative of Eve and the myth of temptation. Since the beginning of biblical history, Eve has carried the weight of a sin that, interestingly enough, was never hers alone. Genesis 3 presents a narrative full of symbolism, where the serpent and the tree of knowledge act as central pieces. But was Eve, in fact, the villain of this story? Alternative texts and Gnostic traditions reframe her figure as a conscious co-creator, someone who sought knowledge, not ruin. Isn't it curious how an act of female curiosity became the biggest taboo in Christian history? The serpent, often seen as a symbol of deception, has another meaning in ancient mythologies. In Sumerian myths, she represents wisdom and transformation, qualities that Eve seems to have embodied when eating the forbidden fruit. But who would benefit from turning this gesture into a sin? The answer may lie in the control that this narrative made possible. Demonizing Eve was an efficient way to justify female submission and construct a theology where spiritual power was monopolized. Passages from Genesis, when compared to texts such as the Enuma Elish, a Babylonian epic, reveal intriguing similarities. This suggests that the temptation myth was adapted from earlier traditions, but with a new aim: to blame women for the fall of humanity. Is Eva, then, just a victim of a larger narrative game? Perhaps his real transgression was questioning the order, a gesture that, as we have seen in other texts, is often censored and persecuted. What is most surprising is how Eve continues to be used as a symbol of guilt and submission, even in modern times. While Adam's act is often treated with leniency, Eve's is labeled as treason. This double standard is not only unfair, it is a narrative strategy that perpetuates inequality. What if Eve, instead of a sinner, was seen as a hero, someone who risked everything in search of knowledge? It's an idea that few dare explore. And then, the uncomfortable question arises: who really gained from the demonization of Eve? If the Genesis narrative had another outcome, how could this have changed the view on the role of women in spirituality? Perhaps it is time to reevaluate the stories we have inherited and prepare to investigate Paul's silence and the passages that shape misogynistic theology. Paul's letters, so revered in the Christian tradition, carry more mysteries than they appear at first glance. Passages like women should keep silent in churches, 1 Corinthians 14:34-35, sound strange when compared to the rest of his writings. After all, the same Paul salutes women like Phoebe and Priscilla for their spiritual contributions. Paleographic studies suggest that these passages may have been interpolations, that is, later additions to reinforce patriarchal control. Did Paul really say this, or did others decide to speak for him? The historical context helps us understand the scenario. Early Christianity was a revolutionary movement, where women played prominent roles. No wonder many religious leaders of the time saw this as a threat to the established order. Manipulating texts attributed to Paul was a way of consolidating female exclusion without much resistance. But how ironic is it to use an apostle's name to justify censoring the same group he respected? By critically investigating these passages, one can see how the changes served a clear purpose: to align Christianity with the patriarchal structures of the Roman Empire. It was an effective strategy to ensure that the church was accepted by the powers of the time. However, this also meant sacrificing an important part of spiritual history. How can we ignore that the persecution of the female role began, literally, with the adulteration of sacred texts? Archaeological evidence, such as inscriptions in Roman catacombs, reveals that women served as deaconesses, preachers, and spiritual leaders. This contrast with the misogynistic passages attributed to Paul is impossible to ignore. Were these fragments deliberately censored to erase a moment when gender equality seemed closer? With each hidden or manipulated page, it becomes clear that women's voices have been silenced in the name of control. And now, we return to the uncomfortable question: why keep these passages in the Bible? Even knowing about their possible manipulation? Maybe it's because they still serve a convenient narrative. But imagine the impact of challenging them and rewriting this history. This brings us to the figure of Mary, mother of Jesus, and how she was molded to fit a model of submission that denied her strength. Mary, mother of Jesus, is perhaps one of the most reimagined figures in religious history. In the early centuries of Christianity, she was seen as a woman of courage, whose transformative faith is extolled in the Magnificat, Luke 1:46-55. However, as time passed, Mary was molded into an idealized, submissive figure more comfortable with the patriarchal narrative of the Church. The Queen of Heaven became the silent mother, a symbol of obedience, while her strength was carefully erased. But why this transition? And who benefited from it? When we analyze Christian iconography, we see that Mary is often associated with female figures from other religions, such as Isis, the Egyptian goddess, who held the young Horus on her lap. These connections indicate that Mary was not only a mother, but also a representation of feminine spiritual power. However, by centering its history on motherhood, the Church limited its influence to a single role. This was no accident. It was a strategy to reinforce female submission within the Christian structure. Marian theology, which has flourished over the centuries, has often reinforced the idea of Mary as an intercessor, but rarely as an active protagonist. Comparing the Magnificat, where Mary exalts justice and challenges the power of the rich, with her submissive image, the contrast is stark. This transformation not only shaped the view of Mary, but also influenced how women were viewed within spirituality. And if this narrative were rescued, how would it alter our perception of the female role in Christian history? However, it is impossible to ignore how the cult of Mary also became a form of resistance. In many cultures, especially in Latin America, Mary took on aspects of ancient goddesses, becoming a symbol of strength and consolation. This paradox reveals how such a powerful figure was transformed and used in different ways. But do we know the real Mary, or just the convenient version presented to us? And so, Mary's story leaves us with a larger question. How many other female figures have been limited or reimagined to meet the needs of power? As we explore the feminine presence in sacred narratives, the mystery of Sophia, divine wisdom, calls us to look beyond appearances and recover the depth of these hidden stories. Sophia, the personification of divine wisdom, is an intriguing figure who straddles diverse spiritual traditions. In Proverbs 8, she is described as standing alongside God in creation, a testimony to his centrality in the cosmos. However, his presence was gradually forgotten, as if his connection to the divine was a secret not to be shared. Gnostic texts, such as those found at Nag Hammadi, reveal Sophia as a co-creator, a female figure of spiritual power who challenges traditional notions. Why was this feminine aspect of divinity so carefully erased? In the Gnostic papyri, Sophia is not just an idea, but an active force that guides creation and humanity. Her story, however, is marked by dualities. She is both the bearer of light and the one who experiences the fall. This complex narrative resonates with older myths, where goddesses represented wisdom and transformation. It is fascinating to see how these texts were persecuted and labeled as heresy, especially because they challenged an exclusively male view of God. Sophia was more than a dangerous idea. She was a threat to the patriarchal order. Sophia's symbolism also appears in Hebrew traditions, such as in Ecclesiasticus 24, where she is described as dwelling with men. This interaction between the divine and the human suggests a more intimate relationship with wisdom than that proposed by conventional narratives. But what happened to that connection? Over time, Sophia was stripped of her relevance, transformed into an abstraction rather than a divine feminine presence. This raises an intriguing question. Who had an interest in making wisdom less accessible? The Nag Hammadi texts present Sophia as someone seeking redemption after her fall, a story that mirrors the human quest for reconnection with the divine. Her figure transcends the supporting role and offers an alternative vision of spirituality, where the feminine has a central place. The exclusion of these ideas is not just a theological issue. It is a cultural and spiritual loss that has shaped the way we perceive divinity. Imagine how different our view of God would be if Sophia were still at the center of this narrative. And so, Sophia invites us to revisit the mystery of the feminine in spirituality. Their exclusion not only erased an essential aspect of theology, but also limited our understanding of creation. Perhaps it is time to rescue this figure, and with it, all the richness of forgotten stories that show us a much more inclusive divine. This leads us to reflect on the role of deaconesses in early Christianity, another piece of the puzzle that has been left out. Imagine an early Christianity where women were spiritual leaders, preachers and deaconesses occupying a prominent place alongside men. Phoebe, mentioned by Paul in Romans 16:1-2, is one such figure, described as a deaconess of the church at Century. She not only assisted in the dissemination of Christian messages, but also acted as a mediator in spiritual matters. However, with the advancement of patriarchal structures in the church, these roles began to disappear. What led to the exclusion of women like Phoebe from the official narrative? Inscriptions in Roman catacombs and historical documents show that deaconesses played a significant role in the early church. They administered baptisms, cared for those in need, and assisted in spiritual rites, functions that placed them in a position of authority. But with the institutionalization of Christianity and the growing alliance with Roman power, female leadership became inconvenient. Isn't it ironic that a tradition founded on spiritual equality has chosen to censor women's protagonism? Studies on early Christianity reveal that the exclusion of deaconesses was not a simple historical oversight, but a deliberate decision to align the church with the patriarchal values of the time. The suppression of these roles shaped the Christian narrative, relegating women to the role of followers while men monopolized spiritual leadership. This strategy not only ensured control of power, but also erased examples of equality that could have transformed the history of religion. The disappearance of the deaconesses also reflects a greater dynamic of persecution of female knowledge. If Phoebe and other leaders had been celebrated, what would that have meant for the structure of the church? Perhaps a more inclusive spirituality, where men and women shared the same authority. But the censorship of these female figures did not erase their influence. It only made his legacy more intriguing. After all, what does an official history want us to know about them? And so the question remains, how many other figures like Phoebe have been silenced, hidden in apocryphal texts, or forgotten in the shadows of history? As we revisit these stories, we begin to realize that early Christianity was much more diverse and egalitarian than we were told. Maybe it's time to reevaluate these narratives and find out what was really excluded. After all, hidden knowledge never disappears completely. He just waits to be rediscovered. If you want to continue this journey of discovery and reflection, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There is much more waiting for you. After all, hidden knowledge is closer than we imagine, and perhaps you will be part of the change that will bring these truths to light.